name is Walt Stewart, and I am a candidate for Assembly District 48. There are 4 people running in this race, and I am different from all of them. The first is that I'm the only one who has actually worked in the legislature. I did some work in the Office of the Speaker and for the legislative committee that oversees state agencies. I went to law school, and I practiced law for the last 37 years. My law firm, which I own, serves individuals, families, and small businesses. And we practice in the courts in southern Wisconsin. We've been before the Court of Appeals and the Wisconsin Supreme Court. We have a number of important issues in this campaign. Obviously, one is the restoration of jobs. I believe that most of the jobs are still there. We just need to bring the consumer dollars back to get the economy going, and we should do so when it is safe to do so. And we see
thanks.
that.
If I should mention, yeah, we're getting your. Thanks for your bio. We're reaching the point. We'll see if we get some of those into the answers. Thank you.
Fine. Okay. So, shall we proceed with the question?
Definitely. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Peter German, he, him, his. I'm a co-chair of the Dane County Chapter. And Greg, you want to quick introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Greg Jabowski. I'm the secretary of the Dane County Chapter of OWR. And this will, that's the other thing I was going to mention. This will be, when we do endorse, it will be an endorsement by the Dane County Chapter of Our Wisconsin Revolution, not the entire statewide organization.
Sure.
Awesome. So just jumping right in. Number one, do you support publicly funded elections, and why or why not?
I thought about that question and found myself even reversing myself as I thought about that. On the one hand, I've never really understood how publicly funded elections would work in a practical sense. But then I thought about my own situation when I decided to run for office. And I realized that there are impediments to running for office in a financial sense. I had to lend money to my campaign so that we could set up a website, so that we could purchase the voter network, so that we could print our nomination papers. Without some type of subsidy or support, many people would find themselves not being able to consider running for office. So in terms of publicly funding campaigns, I think that we need to remove obstacles for people running for campaigns. And if that involves some level of public funding, at least to get people willing to run and willing to serve. So I would say that as far as publicly funding campaigns, we don't want funding to be an obstacle to people running. Now, I do realize that some campaigns can be influenced by special interest money. This money tends to taint the overall process. I think that there may be a need to look at campaign finance reform. But nevertheless, I do see this primarily as an obstacle to getting people to want to run. And I think we need to overcome that obstacle.
Do you favor extending the time frame to vote at the polls during elections to a minimum of 2 weeks ahead of the election date?
No, I see that other countries do have polling that runs for 1 week or 2 weeks. I do think that 1 day is somewhat arbitrary and too short. Obviously, there have been ideas to run an election over a weekend or over a couple of days. The one area that I think is more productive is the use of absentee voting. Most people don't know that there is a substantial period prior to an election when they can go to the clerk's office and they can vote. Likewise, they can request an absentee ballot and receive that ballot. Now, there are the practical problems of having to produce an ID. But when you get that absentee ballot for 55 cents, you can send that ballot in whenever you want, as long as it gets there by the election day. I think that Oregon has had a lot of success with vote by mail. I think that that is the trend where to go. And I think that that will be easier than extending the period that the polls are open. I also question the practicality of getting poll workers to work for 2 weeks. I know it's a challenge to get them to work for 1 day. So I would be concerned about the practicalities of a lengthy voting period.
What model or plan do you prefer for redistricting?
I've often felt that the current way that we do redistricting is too expensive and too litigious. I do like the Iowa concept of a nonpartisan commission drawing the lines. I thought about this question quite a bit and went to the Wisconsin Constitution and note that it happens to be Article 4, Section 3 clearly states that the legislature is charged with the responsibility of drawing the lines. So whatever we talk about in terms of redistricting, we're going to come up against the hard wall of the Constitution. So my thought was, why not have that commission that Governor Evers wants propose a nonpartisan redistricting and present that to the legislature so that the legislature can see what one looks like. The legislature is not going to do it on its own, and you're going to have to put it before the face of the legislature and say, here, what is wrong with this? Can you tell us why you can't adopt a map that looks more like this rather than the odd shapes that you have now? I think unless you put their face in it, they're not going to get it.
What are your top 3 legislative priorities, and what will you do to move them through the legislature?
Well, I do think that we have to restore or recapture the jobs and get the economy back to work. This is critically important well, for the state. Would help to avoid an awful lot of problems that individuals are having, but the state itself is going to suffer a severe revenue loss unless we get people back to work and people buying. Now, I fully realize that we have to balance that against the pandemic and the risk to health. But I do think that we need to stay carefully focused on getting the economy back and getting people back to work. I'm also care about affordable health care. And when I say affordable health care, I don't just mean insurance premiums and the Medicaid expansion. I'm talking about also the availability of health care. We have a nurse shortage. We need to find ways to encourage people to go into the healthcare professions. This nursing shortage is only going to get worse, and it's going to get more expensive unless we get cracking on it right away. A third issue of increased importance are the needs of the older population. Assembly District 48 is similar to many other districts in that our population is getting older, and we need to be sure that they have programs to keep older people active, connected with the community, safe, and that we provide for their care. Many older people are concerned about the possibility that they may need a higher level of institutional care, that they won't be able to stay in their homes. And so they need to know that the state does have programs that they can qualify for, how to qualify for the program, and then get into the program and know that they have care at a time when they need it the most. Now, the best part of your question is, how are you going to advance all that? Under the current system, it looks to me like the Democrats will continue to be in the minority. And the only way that a legislator in the minority party can get anything done is to work with the committees. By the time a bill gets to the floor, the minority, at least the way this legislature is run, has very little influence. So if you want to influence legislation, you have to go to the committees, you have to do the work in the committees. A lot of times that's roll up your shirt sleeves and slog through the problem, come up with options that make the most sense, and convince the other people on the committee that your idea, your option is the best. That is where the work needs to get done.
Thank you. In the emergence from this pandemic, would you support a state-level economic hardship payment? Would you support such direct payments to residents? And then describe your top components that you believe should be in such a bill.
Yes, and we have something like it now that until the end of July, the federal government is adding a $600 a week subsidy to unemployment compensation checks. And the point is to keep the households afloat. I think that, well, I do not know whether the federal government's going to continue that subsidy, but the bottom line is that somebody, and it may very well be the state, needs to come up with a way to keep the households afloat. So things that I would be looking for are people who have suffered a loss of wage and income or a substantial reduction in their employment. So not all people have completely lost employment. Some of them had to go from full-time to part-time. A loss of income due to unavailable childcare. I have one employee, for example, who has 5 small children and had to reduce hours down to half-time because that childcare just was not there. Unfortunate, we like her, we want to keep her, but she can't do it because there isn't childcare out there that would help her. We have businesses that close due to the health department or government orders. Obviously, hotels, restaurants, and so forth. those people, people who work in that industry have suffered that loss due to no fault of their own. We need to keep them around because those hotels and restaurants are going to reopen someday, and we want those people to be available. A business that has been established within 1 year prior to March of 2020. I know that business loans through the federal government required a certain amount of time to be in business before you could qualify for the loans. And the whole idea is to get those people, get those businesses funded to stay funded so that when the economy comes back, they are ready and open and ready to reemploy their people.
How will you guarantee housing to citizens? How will you deal with the financial situation of those facing eviction because of the pandemic? What specific solutions would you propose?
I have trouble with the idea that housing is a guarantee similar to what we might think as a right. I have been concerned in Madison for quite some time that there just isn't enough housing. The demand is great, and the prices are just very, very high. It's so hard to afford housing in Madison. In this current pandemic, however, tenants may need a subsidy to meet their rent, their rental obligation. And I know that the federal government has made some money available, and the state may need to step up as well, because people should not be losing their housing due to this downturn in the economy and the pandemic. Now, in Madison, or in Dane County, probably better, we have a mediation program so that if an eviction action is started, and usually the cause of an eviction is the failure to pay rent, as one of the steps in the process, people undergo mediation in an attempt to figure out how can we work out an arrangement between the landlord and the tenant stays in the apartment, and the landlord is paid their rent in some amount that they can negotiate. That helps to avoid a lot of evictions. And the next part is very important, because if the landlord does carry out the eviction, now we've got an empty unit. The people who are going to be applying for that unit may very well be people who have been evicted from a previous unit. Now, all you're doing is cycling people from one spot to the next. That's wasteful. It makes no sense. So I think that we have to find ways to subsidize tenants during this difficult period, and have landlords and tenants work together to realize that no one benefits from a process that says, let's go straight for eviction.
Will you fight for a single-payer healthcare system at the state level? And would you support a federal single-payer healthcare system?
Yes, and my short answer is I'm surprised that we don't have that already. I buy health insurance for my employees. I pay for their premiums. I have done so for at least 3 decades, and I've watched as healthcare costs just go up and up and up and up, and without any real ceiling in sight. So I look at a national, or a state perhaps, but a national healthcare system as something that will inevitably happen. The only question is when, how fast, what are going to be the obstacles to that? Who are going to be the key actors who actively try to avoid that? In the meantime, you have small employers like me who pay whatever the health insurer tells you that you're going to pay. You can probably find a cheaper plan, but the person who then suffers under the cheaper plan is the employee, who ends up having to pay maybe a higher deductible or co-pays or some services that are not covered. We try to provide good quality health insurance, and if you leave it up to the marketplace, I don't think that you're going to make the kind of progress that you really want when you go to a single payer system.
Will you pass workers' rights laws, helping those who, or you work to pass workers' rights laws, helping those who are forced to return to work, but who risk infection from COVID-19? Absent, very likely will be continuing if you get in the legislature. Absent the equivalent of a single payer system, will you push the state to guarantee medical coverage through Badger Care for those affected in this way?
I see this question as more of a workers' compensation question. The way it was phrased is that workers who contract illness as a result of putting themselves in harm's way. And I know that this was an issue before the most recent legislature when it said, when it made special treatment for law enforcement and emergency medical people concerning when or if they would contract COVID-19. I think that that legislation was ill-conceived, and I think that if you're going to be putting yourself in a position of working with COVID-19 patients and you contract that, that looks to me to be a workers' compensation issue that ought to be covered, and that would then address many of the other points of the question, which is how is that going to be paid for?
Thank you very much. So this next question is a little bit of a sort of a lightning round. So I'll list a few policies and you can indicate whether you're for or against them. I'll say just starting out. Do you support the propositions outlined in Campaign Zero, which includes ending broken windows policing?
Yes, to the extent that I understand broken windows policing as it came out of New York City, I never quite figured what the connection was. I realize that you do want to keep your neighborhoods up, but I don't see that as a basis for stepping up police enforcement, especially since law enforcement, it seems like a poor use of law enforcement dollars.
Increasing community oversight?
There I would have, my problem is more chronic to this issue. The real issue is what level of community supervision should you have with the police? The other side of the coin is how much politics do you want to put into policing policy? There is a balance between the police doing their job and the community overseeing the police because it's the community that is served by them. So I think that every community needs to find that balance. And I know that different communities have, whether they have police fire commissions or the police office, the chief is hired by the common council. The whole point being is that you have to draw the line somewhere, and that line is probably best drawn at the local level.
Limiting use of force?
Oh, definitely. I think that there should be statewide standards for the use of force. I'm thinking particularly in terms of chokeholds, for example. The use of the knee on the neck, obviously, is the hot one now. But yes, the use of force standards needs to be clarified and needs to be better taught.
Independent investigation and prosecution of officers?
Yes, I know that many communities do that. If there is an incident involving an officer, then the investigation may be jobbed out to a different police department. The prosecution may be jobbed out to a different district attorney. So I do think that there needs to be that sense of distance. Now, you still have the practical problem. Is this the police overseeing the police? Does it really matter which district attorney does which? I think that has to go to the quality of the investigation, and that there may need to be clear standards for what we expect from these investigators.
Increased community representation inside of these investigations?
I think that goes back to the community oversight. I think that the question is very similar to the community oversight, in which we're asking, well, in this community, what should be the level of citizen involvement? And again, what is the risk that citizen involvement will become more of a political matter rather than a law enforcement matter? You don't want the police to be political actors responding to political demands. On the other hand, you do want them to operate as a professional organization charged with protecting the community that they serve. So I think this is another one of those balancing questions.
Increasing the amount of body cams / filming of the police?
Yes, I heard an interesting discussion about body cameras on the radio just this morning. I favor body cameras because I think it gives the police and the community one clear opportunity to see what is going on. Now, some people say, well, the body cameras should be turned off during protests and demonstrations because that's a type of police surveillance. The response to that is, well, you turn that off and that just invites police misconduct. So, but I think on the whole, I come down on the side in favor of body cameras as the incentive to minimize or avoid police misconduct.
Increasing training for officers.
Well, I think that it's clear that officers need more training. Some of that training we should be looking at in terms of de-escalating situations. Also, perhaps we need to find a way to divert some of that police work away from the officers and into social workers or mental health providers. And one part of training is for the police to be able to identify that kind of a problem, to know when to say, this is not really the kind of thing that a police officer ought to be doing. There are other people who are better equipped to handle it. That would be a good kind of training to have.
Thank you. Ending for-profit policing.
Yes, I think that question goes to police who, when they're not on the job, they hire themselves out as enforcement or security people. I would ask the question, well, why does the police officer need to be doing the security detail? I think that there are other, I can't imagine why we need that level of sophistication in our private security people. So I don't, and I also think that that presents the opportunity for the police officer to use some of those tactics that we don't want our police officers to use, but now they're using that in the private sector as a security guard. And I think that's exactly the kind of behavior that we're trying to avoid. I don't think that makes the police look good.
And the final point here, demilitarization of the police.
Yes, this is another one that I've thought about quite a bit. The militarization of the police presents the appearance that it's the police versus the community. And the police are not at war with the community. I'm not saying that there aren't some military tools that would be useful for policing, but when you see the police come in on a multi-ton vehicle designed to fire mortars or something along those lines, I just don't see the use for that. And so I think that that may be a misapplication of resources to policing, and I think the police can do better without that level of militarization.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll go on. More policing questions, not a checklist this time. First one's a multiple choice though. And I will support blank funding for the police. I'll support increasing funding for the police. I would support leveling funding for the police. I would support decreasing funding for the police, or I would support eliminating funding for the police.
My answer was to adjust that level, which is probably the same as decreasing. And the reason for that is that, as I mentioned earlier, I think that some of those police dollars could be used more effectively and efficiently. The police, as I said, do not need to be militarized. The police need to know when there is a situation that can be handled better by a different type of professional. And I think that that suggests that some of those policing dollars could be diverted to other public resources.
Okay. A police officer in your jurisdiction, say the district you're elected to, has been filmed killing someone they have stopped or arrested. How do you respond?
I would want to get the facts. I'm not going to say that just because a person has died in the presence of a police officer means that the police officer automatically did something wrong. We know that policing is much more sophisticated than that. But I do think it merits an investigation, and I do think that we need to get the facts. And that gets us back to a previous question about investigations into police activity.
List other propositions you have regarding policing that you'll fight for.
On several occasions, I have raised the question of whether we need to reform the doctrine of qualified immunity. The doctrine makes it extremely difficult to hold a police officer civilly or criminally or professionally responsible for what happens when he or she is on duty. And this, I think, can be construed to allow police lawlessness to be unchecked. We're supposed to be able to discipline police officers and hold them responsible, but as long as the courts uphold the current doctrine of qualified immunity, I really don't think you're going to get a whole lot of change in police officer liability and responsibility.
Moving on to a little bit more of a personal history question. So who did you support in the 2020 Democratic Party presidential primary this year? And why? And then when did you start sort of publicly supporting them?
All right. I think a lot of it depends upon how far back you consider the current presidential primaries. Many people would say that it started in 2016. But I did attend a function in 2018 with Tammy Baldwin, and her guest was Kamala Harris. And I thought that Senator Harris just did a fantastic job. And I remember turning to my wife and saying, you might have just seen the next president of the United States. We were both very, very impressed with her and both liked her a great deal. As we wound through the campaign, however, we, at least speaking only for myself, of course, tended to move towards Vice President Biden, and that is where I am right now. And that has been probably the case since the early part of this year, when it became obvious that he was going to be a serious candidate. So in terms of my public support of Vice President Biden, I haven't been asked for it other than, who do you like and who do you support? And that's tried to be honest with that.
What's your analysis of the Evers administration handling of the COVID-19 crisis in Wisconsin, including the handling of the processes leading up to the April 7th election? And the same question for the state legislature's handling of that.
Well, I agreed with how the governor handled the issues surrounding the pandemic. I agreed with the safer at home order. Now, again, I say reluctantly because nobody really likes the order. But those of us who will follow it carefully understand how important it is. So I like the safer at home order. As we approach the election, I like the emphasis, as I said before, on absentee ballots. Many other states postponed their election. I thought those were good ideas. So on the whole, I thought that he was exhibiting the proper amount of leadership that was needed under the circumstances. Now, the other side of the question is, what do you think of the legislature? Well, the legislature gave us about what I expected them. Whatever Governor Evers was trying to achieve, their answer was no. And they obstructed it all along the way, and they got the Supreme Court to go along with them. I thought that was very unfortunate. I was quite concerned about the risk to public health because of the April 7 in-person election. Perhaps I was overly cautious. Maybe now that we've had enough time since then, when we see that we didn't really get the spike, but we didn't know it then. And I think that the governor was making the best decisions that he could at the time, and the legislature was obstructed.
Thank you. So next, would you consider yourself supportive of the BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement?
Well, I found that to be a very good question because I actually knew very little about it and had to look into that. First, I question whether that is really an appropriate question for somebody running for the assembly district in Wisconsin. I have not seen any issues at the legislative level having to deal with this, and maybe it's because they're happening and I'm just not noticing it. But I have not taken a position on BDS. Now, of course, if somebody were to say, well, do you support the proposition that Israel should be following international law? That topic was also raised. I heard it on the radio this morning, and there are calls from around the world for Israel to follow international law. We expect the United States to follow international law. So to the extent that international law is bearing on this question, and I believe it does, I think that Israel's got to answer for that.
Definitely. And one of the reasons we asked that question, just to clarify, is because a little while back, the Wisconsin legislature passed a resolution that effectively banned BDS from most college campuses in the state.
Well, then I've got something to look into.
And that's part of the focus of the next question. Do you believe that protesting is a form of speech, and therefore the right to do so, including BDS and anti-pipeline movements, should not be punished? These have both been addressed, and have actually laws passed by the legislature recently.
Well, I remember in 2011, the issue of protesting came before Judge John Albert here in Dane County. And in early legal proceedings, I believe Judge Albert said, okay, well, let's get our definitions clear. The definition of a protester is a person who is engaged in constitutionally protected activity. That translates to, if you're protesting, the police have as much duty to protect you and your security as they have any other duty. And so as long as we are engaged in constitutionally protected activity, I do support protesters. Now, you do have a question of what happens if the protest moves onto private property. And I think that may depend upon the facts and circumstances at that time. But I also feel that protesting, at least in my vocabulary, does not include destruction of public property or private property or harm to other persons.
Thank you very much. So the next two questions are just a little bit more, sort of technical questions. List of campaign. So number 15, list any unions that may have already endorsed you in this race, and which labor endorsements are you currently actively seeking?
I'm not aware of any labor union endorsements in this race yet. I know that there are some unions that are looking actively into making endorsements. I have met with Wisconsin Education Association Council. I've met with Madison Teachers Incorporated and with the building trades on the issue of whether to endorse. So I've asked them, but I have not heard anything back from any of the unions so far.
Next one's regarding fundraising. How much have you raised for this race to date? There's a bunch of questions if you want to look at them all.
Sure.
Who are your top 3 donors?
Okay.
And what percentage of your total is from those top donors? How much of it is strictly from small individual donors of less than $50? And if this is not your first election, please answer this question regarding your last election as well.
Well, this is my first election, so that makes it somewhat easy. We have been keeping careful track of our finances because we have a report due July 15 for fundraising through June 30. And so I tried to gather as much information as I could, anticipating this question. The answer as of June 30 is that we have raised over $20,000. The three top donors in our campaign would include Joseph Dooley, a retired professor of social work, Timothy Radlett, who is a nonprofit activist, and John Burke, who is a manufacturer. Their contributions are about 14.5% of the total of what we have raised. We do have many small donors, and I tried to get the information by today as to how many donors we have under $50. Unfortunately, I'm not able to tell you that because I just don't have that information. I'm a little hesitant to even give a number, but I suspect that number is probably going to be around 50.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So next one, do you support the legalization of recreational cannabis, including the expungement of all previous cannabis-related charges and release of all those currently serving time for such charges?
Yes. And I mean my yes to be applied to all of those questions. I think that when the legislature finally decides to take this seriously, the legislature will give lip service to medicinal uses. Then the legislature will say, oh, well, it's a libertarian issue, let people do what they want to do. At the end of the day, this legislature is going to be guided by the tax revenue. They're going to be looking at Colorado and Illinois and some of these other states and saying, okay, what impact does legalized recreational and medicinal marijuana have on our coffers? And I'm not saying that that's the best reason, but that will be the way you get to 51%.
Thanks.
Oh, and by the way,
oh.
let me add also, you asked about the release of persons who are incarcerated for minor drug offenses. And I think that, again, yes, it's a good idea from public policy standpoint, but what's really going to drive this legislature is the cost of incarcerating so many people for such minor offenses. Again, it sounds like I'm overly concerned with costs, but it's really the legislature that's going to be in a bind, that's going to be making decisions based upon what the people can afford.
And do you have paid staff or consultants working on your campaign? And if so, what percentage of your campaign funding goes to paid staff or consultants?
Thank you. That's a fair question. The answer is I do not have paid staff, but I do have consultants. That is, persons who we have hired to provide services for us. Those services would include digital advertising and marketing. Again, the kind of activity that a lawyer would not normally know very much about. We also we pay for graphic arts for our printing and so forth, and for videography and video production. Again, not the kinds of things that I would normally know how to do on my own, and often somewhat difficult to get volunteers to do it. So far, we estimate that between 25 and 30% of our expenses has been towards consulting.